There is a recurring pattern in history, a ruthless code of destruction that has dismantled 3 global superpowers in the last 500 years. We are conditioned by our education to believe a convenient and comforting lie, that these titans fell on the battlefield, defeated by superior military force, or overwhelmed by a catastrophic foreign invasion. The truth is far colder, much more disturbing, and largely ignored by the masses. Spain in 1590 controlled half the world's gold supply and dominated the oceans with an armada that struck fear into every capital in Europe. Britain in 1914 ruled an empire where the sun never set, controlling nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and population. Backed by the most sophisticated financial system the world had ever seen, the Soviet Union in 1980 possessed the largest standing army in history, a vast network of satellite states, and aimed 30,000 nuclear warheads at the West. Yet, within a few short decades of their absolute peak, they were gone, bankrupt, dissolved, or reduced to second-rate irrelevance. Living in the shadow of their former glory, they did not lose a war that ended their existence. They lost their ledger. What destroyed them was not a general, but a mathematical sequence, a precise, 7-stage cycle of economic implosion that is repeated with terrifying accuracy across centuries, regimes, and ideologies. It is an algorithm of decay, and it does not care about your flag, your nuclear arsenal, your patriotic fervor, or your belief in national exceptionalism. This brings us to the United States of America in 2025. It is difficult for those living inside the empire to see the rot, primarily due to a psychological phenomenon known as normalcy bias. We assume that because the system has worked for our entire lives, it will continue to work forever. But if you strip away the political rhetoric, the media spin, and the stock market exuberance, and look solely at the raw economic data, the conclusion is inescapable. America is not merely approaching this historical pattern. We are deep inside it. We have already completed stage 1 through stage 5. The symptoms you feel daily are not random. The crushing inflation that eats your savings is not an accident. It is policy. The fracturing society that turns neighbor against neighbor is not just cultural. It is a symptom of shrinking resources. The unpayable debt that looms over your children's future is not mismanagement. It is the mathematical inevitability of a fiat currency system nearing its end. These are not bugs in the system. They are the features of a terminal phase. The sequence is locked in. The only variable remaining is time. To understand your future, you must first dissect the autopsy of the past. Specifically, the hidden mechanism that traps empires in a cycle of their own making. The collapse mechanism begins with a simple, fatal calculation. The moment the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the wealth it generates, this is the imperial trap. At first, the decline is invisible to the average citizen. The monuments are still standing, the currency still spends, and the military still wins skirmishes abroad. But beneath the surface, the foundation has shifted from wealth creation to wealth destruction. The first symptom of this terminal disease is always the same. Stage 1. Military overextension. In the late 16th century, Spain was the undisputed master of the world. Yet King Philip II was spending 50% of the empire's total revenue just to service military debts and pay foreign mercenaries. They were fighting simultaneously in the Mediterranean against the Ottomans, in the Netherlands against Protestant rebels, in France, and in the Americas. They had commitments on 4 continents they could not physically or financially sustain. The gold flowing in from the New World was immediately flowing out to pay for wars that yielded no return on investment. The empire became a pass-through entity for wealth, enriching its enemies while bankrupting itself. 3 centuries later, the Soviet Union fell into the exact same trap. To project power globally and maintain the illusion of communist superiority, they spent between 15 and 20% of their entire GDP on the military, triple what the United States was spending at the time. They were propping up client regimes in Cuba, Angola, Vietnam, and Eastern Europe, trying to match American global reach with an economy that was a fraction of the size. They prioritized tanks over tractors and missiles over medicine. They bankrupted their society to defend an image of strength. Now, look at the American ledger today. The United States currently maintains over 750 military bases in 80 countries. We have active troops deployed in 150 nations. Our annual defense budget is $850 billion, more than the next 10 nations combined. However, dollars do not fight wars. Industrial capacity does. While the U.S. Navy struggles to maintain its existing fleet due to a lack of skilled labor in dry docks, China's shipbuilding capacity is now 200 times greater than that of the United States. We are committed to defending NATO borders in Europe, maritime routes in Asia, and interests in the Middle East. Yet, our equipment is aging. and recruitment is plummeting to historic lows as the younger generation loses faith in the institutions. This is not defense. This is imperial policing funded by debt. We are stretched so thin that a simultaneous crisis in Taiwan, Ukraine, and the Persian Gulf would break the system's logistical spine. The Pentagon has failed its audit for the 6th time in a row, unable to account for trillions of dollars in assets. This lack of accountability is characteristic of late-stage empires, where the military-industrial complex becomes a parasite on the host economy. But military overextension is only the expenditure side of the ledger. When the bills come due and tax revenue is not enough to cover the imperial ambition, the empire commits its second fatal error. When an empire runs up bills it cannot pay through honest taxation. It resorts to the oldest fraud in financial history: debasement. They stop extracting wealth from the people openly and start stealing it secretly through the currency. The mechanism changes with technology, but the result is always the same: the destruction of the currency's purchasing power to keep the regime afloat. In the early 1600s, the Spanish crown faced a math problem. They needed silver to pay their armies, but the mines were depleting and the costs were rising. So, they began mixing copper into the silver coinage. A coin that was once pure value became 50% copper, then 75%. The face value remained the same, but the real value vanished. The Roman Empire did the same with the denarius, reducing its silver content from nearly 100% to barely 5% before the fall. This act of clipping coins is the ancestor of modern quantitative easing. Great Britain followed a more sophisticated path. In 1931, crushed by war debts and the Great Depression, they simply abandoned the gold standard. Overnight, the British pound, the bedrock of global trade, lost 25% of its value. It was a default in all but name, robbing every saver in the empire to bail out the government. The United States has industrialized this process. In 1971, President Nixon severed the dollar from gold, turning it into a pure fiat instrument backed only by government promises. This temporarily solved the gold drain, but unleashed a monster. But the real acceleration began recently. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve has printed over $6 trillion. We did not mix copper into coins. We added zeros to a digital ledger. The effect is identical. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. This creates a phenomenon known as the Cantillon effect. The money does not enter the economy evenly. It goes to the government and the financial elite first, who buy assets at current prices. By the time that new money reaches your wage packet, prices of housing, food, and energy have risen to absorb it. This is not inflation, as the news describes it. It is a hidden tax. It is a wealth transfer mechanism from the poor to the rich. It is the systematic liquidation of the middle class to keep the sovereign solvent. This leads to a state of fiscal dominance, where the central bank loses the ability to fight inflation because raising interest rates would bankrupt the government. We are trapped in a monetary prison. The authorities often mask this with shrinkflation or by manipulating the consumer price index CPI to exclude essentials like food and energy. But your wallet knows the truth. Printing money creates a false boom that inevitably demands more borrowing to sustain, pushing the empire into the next irreversible phase. When a nation debases its currency, it does not solve the problem. It merely buys time at the cost of the future. Eventually, the accumulated liabilities reach a mathematical singularity known as the debt spiral. This is the point of no return. It occurs when a government must borrow new money not to build infrastructure, improve education, or fund services, but simply to pay the interest on its existing debt. The borrower becomes a slave to the lender, and the national budget becomes a fiction. History shows this stage is always violent for the treasury. Spain, unable to control its spending despite the influx of silver, declared bankruptcy 4 times in just 40 years between 1557 and 1596. They did not lack income, they lacked discipline. Each default shattered confidence and raised the cost of future borrowing. Accelerating the spiral, Britain faced a similar reckoning. By 1945, after fighting 2 world wars on credit, the United Kingdom owed the United States and Canada over $30 billion, a sum larger than its entire GDP. The empire had technically won the war, but financially, it had already surrendered. The austerity measures that followed lasted for decades, effectively ending Britain's ability to project power. The United States has now entered this exact terminal velocity. The national debt stands at $36 trillion, exceeding 120% of GDP. But the headline number is less terrifying than the service cost. Interest payments on this debt are approaching $1 trillion annually. For the first time in history, America is spending more to service its past mistakes than it spends on its national defense. We are running a deficit of $1.8 trillion in 2024. During peacetime, with a purportedly growing economy, This is not sustainable economics. It is a Ponzi scheme operating at a sovereign level. We are borrowing from future generations to pay the interest to current bondholders. Furthermore, this does not even account for the unfunded liabilities, Social Security and Medicare, which some estimates place at over $170 trillion. These are promises the government has made but has zero money set aside to keep. This is what economists call a Minsky moment in the making, a sudden collapse of asset values, which is part of the credit cycle or business cycle. When a superpower reaches this stage, it ceases to be a master of its own destiny. It becomes fragile. One spike in interest rates, one failed bond auction, or one downgrade by a ratings agency, and the illusion of solvency shatters. But as the financial economy balloons into a bubble of debt and paper promises, the physical economy, the ability to actually make things, begins to rot from the inside. There is a fatal paradox that strikes every dying empire. As their financial wealth explodes, their physical ability to produce real value collapses. This is the stage of hollowing out. When a nation can print money or plunder resources without effort, it forgets how to work. The economy shifts from industrialization to financialization. Corporations stop investing in research and development and start spending profits on stock buybacks to artificially inflate share prices. They stop being makers and become mere consumers, dependent on the very rivals they seek to dominate. Spain, in the 17th century, provides the perfect autopsy of this decay. They possessed mountains of silver from the Americas, yet their domestic industry rotted. Why build ships or weave cloth when you can simply buy them from the Dutch or the French? Spain became a conduit economy. Wealth flowed into Cadiz and immediately flowed out to the rest of Europe to pay for imports. They owned the money, but their enemies owned the means of production. By the time the mines ran dry, Spain had forgotten how to feed itself. The Soviet Union faced a different version of this reality. By the 1980s, despite having some of the most fertile soil on Earth, the USSR was forced to import millions of tons of grain from the United States. Their central planning system had destroyed the incentive to produce. Factories met quotas by producing junk that no one could use. They had nuclear missiles, but they could not bake bread. The United States has now replicated this vulnerability with terrifying precision. We have gutted our manufacturing base in the name of efficiency, shipping critical industries to China, Mexico, and Vietnam. We run an annual trade deficit of over $800 billion. We design in California and finance in New York. But the physical reality is built in Shenzhen. This is not just an economic issue, it is a strategic suicide. America is now 100% dependent on foreign supply chains for essential antibiotics, advanced microchips, and high-grade steel. We are critically dependent on China for rare earth minerals, which are essential for everything from electric vehicles to fighter jets. Rebuilding this industrial base takes decades, not years. In a conflict, we cannot print artillery shells. We cannot digitally generate penicillin. We have financialized our economy to the point where we trade paper promises while our adversaries weld the steel that builds the future. We have prioritized the short-term profits of shareholders over the long-term security of the nation. The result is a fragile system where a disruption in a port halfway across the world can empty our shelves and halt our assembly lines. But when an economy stops working and starts speculating, the rot spreads from the factory floor to the street. When the currency is debased and the factories close, the rot moves from the balance sheet to the street. This is stage 5, social decay. It is the moment the social contract breaks. The citizenry realizes the system is rigged against them, and the resulting loss of trust shatters the nation's cohesion. A high-trust society enables commerce and growth. A low-trust society breeds stagnation and violence. When you cannot trust your currency, you cannot trust your government. And eventually, you cannot trust your neighbor. The elite retreat into gated communities, insulating themselves from the consequences of their policies. While the rest of society fights over the scraps of a dying economy, Spain in the mid-1600s offers a grim preview. As the economy failed, crime exploded, and beggars filled the streets of Madrid. The most productive citizens, the merchants, the artisans, the thinkers, fled the country for England and the Netherlands. Spain was left with a hollowed-out population consisting only of bureaucrats, soldiers, and priests, those who consumed wealth rather than created it. The United States is currently locked in this exact phase. Look around. Trust in our institutions, the media, the government, the banks, is at all-time lows. We are witnessing an explosion of deaths of despair, with drug overdoses, particularly from fentanyl, killing over 100,000 Americans annually. Homelessness is not just rising, it is becoming a permanent feature of our urban landscape. With tent cities resembling refugee camps in major metropolitan areas, The political dysfunction we see in Washington is not the cause of our decline. It is a symptom of it. We cannot agree on anything because the underlying economic reality has fractured us into warring tribes. It is reminiscent of the behavioral sink observed in John Calhoun's experiments, where overcrowding and resource inequality led to total social collapse. The best and brightest are checking out, minimizing their participation in a game they know they cannot win. We see the rise of populism, civil unrest, and a general sense of malaise. The shared values that once bound the nation together are dissolving in the acid of economic desperation. The Soviet Union reached this stage of internal rot just before its dissolution. They had the weapons, but they had lost the people. America has completed stage 5. We are standing on the precipice of the final 2 stages, the ones that turn a decline into a collapse. Once the social fabric tears, the empire enters the terminal phase. This is where the mathematical certainty of collapse meets geopolitical reality. It begins with stage 6, loss of reserve currency status. This is the moment the world stops trusting the empire's IOUs. For decades, the United States has enjoyed an exorbitant privilege, a term coined by the French to describe America's unique ability to borrow in its own currency. We print dollars to buy real goods, and the world holds those dollars as a safe asset, but that trust is finite. It relies on the belief that the U.S. is a neutral arbiter of the global financial system. We are seeing the cracks form in real time. The turning point was likely in 2022, when the U.S. weaponized the dollar system to freeze Russian sovereign assets. While intended as a punishment, it sent a chilling message to the rest of the world. Your reserves are not safe if you disagree with Washington. This weaponization of SWIFT accelerated the formation of the BRICS alliance, which is now actively developing alternative payment systems to bypass the U.S. dollar. Furthermore, the petrodollar agreement, established in 1974, where Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars in exchange for U.S. military protection, is fracturing. Saudi Arabia is now open to trading oil in Chinese yuan, a direct strike against the financial system that has underpinned American hegemony since the 1970s. When this dam breaks, trillions of unwanted dollars currently held overseas will flood back to the American homeland. This is the Triffin dilemma, playing out in its final act. The result will not be simple inflation. It will be hyperinflationary checking mate. This triggers stage 7, sudden implosion. History warns us that empires do not decline gracefully. They fall off a cliff. Collapse is never linear. It is exponential. The Soviet Union went from a terrifying superpower to a non-existent state in just 900 days. There was no foreign invasion, no World War III. The money simply stopped working. The debt became unpayable, and the political center evaporated. Britain lost its global empire in less than 20 years, shrinking from the master of the world to a small island nation dependent on American aid following the Suez Crisis, which exposed its weakness to the world. When stage 7 hits, it happens faster than the mind can process. A currency crisis triggers a debt crisis, which triggers a political collapse. One day the supermarkets are full, the next, the supply chains halt because the currency is rejected. The superpower becomes a cautionary tale overnight. 3 empires followed this pattern: Spain, Britain, the USSR. Each believed they were exceptional. Each believed the rules of economics did not apply to them because of their military might or their cultural superiority. They were wrong every single time. Today, we are telling ourselves the same comforting lies. We say, we are America. We have the technology. We have the world reserve currency. It cannot happen here. But the pattern does not care about American exceptionalism. It is purely mathematical. You cannot spend beyond your means forever. You cannot maintain a global empire without domestic productive capacity. And you certainly cannot print your way to prosperity. Once you have completed stages 1 through 5, the sequence for stages 6 and 7 is not just probable, it is locked in. The most alarming aspect is the speed. Since 2020, the United States has not just been walking down this path, we have been sprinting. We have printed more money, incurred more debt, and hollowed out more industries in the last 4 years than in the previous 4 decades combined. The timeline is compressing. What took Spain a century and Britain 20 years might take us only a few years once the breaking point is reached. The people running this system, the central bankers, the politicians, the ultra-wealthy, they know this. Why do you think central banks are hoarding gold at record rates? Why are tech billionaires building bunkers and buying vast tracts of farmland? They are not betting on the recovery of the system. They are hedging against its mathematically inevitable conclusion. They understand that when the fiat experiment fails, the world returns to tangible assets. They see the trap closing, and they are quietly moving toward the exits while telling the public that the economy is strong and resilient. We are now living on borrowed time, quite literally. The pattern has been triggered. The mechanism is in motion. Do not make the mistake of thinking a political savior can reverse this. Elections change faces. They do not change arithmetic. No politician can campaign on the platform of defaulting on the national debt or slashing the military by 50%. Yet that is exactly what the mathematics of survival demands. The political will to take the necessary pain does not exist in a democracy addicted to cheap money. The system has passed the event horizon. The pilot is no longer flying the plane. Gravity is. Look at the ghosts of the past. Spain today is a pleasant tourist destination for Northern Europeans. Irrelevant on the world stage. The British Empire is a museum exhibit of what used to be. The Soviet Union is a cautionary chapter in history books. These were the masters of the universe. And now they are memories. America is not immune. In 20 years, will we be a superpower? Or will we be a relic? The pattern is visible if you have the courage to look. The answers are not hiding in the future, they are screaming from the past. So, the next time you see a bank bailout, or the price of bread jump, or a new war start that we cannot afford, do not call it news. Recognize it for what it is. The bell tolling for stage 6. The greatest transfer of wealth in history is underway. Those who hold paper will lose everything. Those who hold real assets may survive. History has shown us exactly what comes next. I suggest you get ready.